please.
Okay, thank you so much for coming, everybody. So this is everybody who's part of Qualia Research Institute. Raise your hands. Well, there's somebody in a meditative trance over there. but yeah, so it's me, Mike, Romeo. We're kind of the co-founders, and currently we have 3 interns, and we're really excited to have you guys over here to kind of do some synergy and figure out the nature of reality. And one of the ways to do that is to kind of look into art. So we kind of like want to rescue art and actually find a convergent sense in which all of us can produce really cool experiences without necessarily, harming each other in the process. Which currently that's the state of the art. Yeah, so I will talk about basically 8 models. The first 4 models are kind of the current kind of like ideas of art in the meme space, definitely kind of like rationalist, affective altruist views on what art is and how it emerges and what it can be useful for. That's the first 4. The other 4 are kind of like original from the Qualia Research. And we're really excited to share. I also will make an announcement that we have 40 copies of it, and definitely before you leave, take one with you. I mean, yeah, feel free to take one now, but definitely before you leave, have a copy. There's enough for everybody. Okay, very good.
Still good on lighting?
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, model number 1. Art as family resemblance. So I think like before the 20th century, there was definitely a lot of conceptual confusion about art. And there's a very big reason why is because people really kind of like thought that for any given concept, especially any given kind of like big coherent concept, there ought to be kind of like necessary and sufficient conditions for them, right? So for example, people, definitely Aristotelian logic, if you think about like, hey, like what is justice, what is goodness, it's kind of like there's a necessary and sufficient set of conditions for them. Okay, so yeah, definitely a lot of insights from example like Wittgenstein, Russell, Quine, kind of like they think of language as kind of these groundless networks relationships with no necessary kind of ultimate grounding to the meaning of things. So in a sense, if you actually want to talk about art, the way they would say about it is that we need to talk about like how the word art is used. And you're not actually going to find a set of necessary and sufficient conditions that will, actually elucidate the essence of art. And this will definitely clarify a lot of things. There is kind of a problem with it, which is that it doesn't necessarily point to where art adds value, right? It's kind of more kind of a deconstructive move. It's important to get rid of some conceptual confusion, but it doesn't necessarily advance you any forward. So I would think of this as kind of like the starting point rather than any kind of like ending point. So basically there's no essence necessarily to art, but maybe there are really valuable things in art, and that's something that we should really kind of pay attention to. Definitely each of these models also come with kind of like an aesthetic associated with them in a sense. And you can think of this as kind of like a meta level, because if you have a theory of art, then you can produce art about that theory. And I would say that 2 examples of the first aesthetic are Dadaism and pop art. Like the very famous quote by Andy Warhol is, "Art is whatever you can get away with." Definitely, there were like all of these manifestos in the 1920s about like, let's push the boundary of art, let's just completely revolutionize how people conceptualize it. Let's just put a urinal on an art exhibit and call it art and see how people react. People were like very divided about this, but ultimately, yeah, I mean, within this aesthetic, that's a perfectly valid move. I would say it's interesting for a number of reasons, and in one of the further models, we'll explain actually why this is interesting. But so far, this is almost kind of a little bit too deconstructive. It doesn't necessarily show you where the good stuff is. So the second model is art as signaling, and particularly, I would add Kolke theory, which we'll get in a second. So evolutionary psychology, and of course, many of you probably have read The Mating Mind by Jeffrey Miller, if not also The Elephant in the Brain by Hansen. Like, There's like a lot of really good insights there about what actually drives a lot of art in society. So here are like some things that you can kind of infer from evolutionary psychology. So first of all, symmetrical average faces will be very prominent in popular art. Likewise, it's kind of like a well-rounded sense of intelligence. Energy levels, that's kind of like definitely signaling a lot of like fitness. If people are like producing a lot, they're very prolific in their art. The one-factor personality model, right? Like you know that you can decompose personality into these 5 factors, the big 5 personality traits. What's almost kind of creepy is that if you just do a one-factor factor analysis on it, you will see that all of those factors are actually correlated with each other, and there's this meta factor that basically bunches them together, and that's like the big one, and that's basically signaling more openness, more extroversion, more agreeableness, more conscientiousness, and less neuroticism. It's really sad. A lot of people are very low in the big one, and they usually are described as kind of like difficult people. And people who are like very high in the big one, tend to be very successful, and like definitely society rewards that. Disease resistance, so kind of for example, tolerance to disgust is one thing that you would expect to see in art. It's kind of like a signaling strategy. Wealth, power, and popularity, like anything that shows those things, of course, is going to be kind of artistic within this model. So you can basically expect art to include traditionally beautiful people, hard to fake signals of power, wealth, popularity, large amounts of waste. That's kind of like a very key feature. Hey, like if you're able to waste a ton of resources, that means that you have a lot to spare. Art would be very difficult to perform. Definitely, you can think of like list mania. In the 1800s, people were like the first instance of people like fainting in performances. And it's not that like the extremely difficult to perform music is necessarily better because it's difficult to perform, but it's more sexy. It has more sex appeal because there's kind of this factor of like, oh my gosh, how did you do this? You're almost kind of like one level above other normal humans. You would also expect kind of like all of these conspicuous generation of excuses for signaling with one's fitness. It's kind of you will see kind of like these pockets where suddenly there's like this box that is like very, very heavy, and people will say like, oh, I can help you lift that out, and like in a sense like that's how people signal their fitness in that way. Definitely very popular art. All of them tend to contain people who are like very evolutionary fit in a very generic sense. And that is like across cultures and across all sorts of places in the state space of genomes of humans. You can definitely do this analysis of basically finding kind of like the average between faces. And so there's this misconception that people have that attractiveness is in a sense kind of like something very, 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 very personal for people. But if you actually conduct the studies, you will find that there's a like 0.9 correlation in people's judgments about like attractiveness. And there's like these, very simple features. People get plastic surgeries. There's kind of like a general gradient towards they're pushing. All of these, it's kind of disheartening, but it seems to be true, definitely for mainstream art. This is kind of like an example of what some of you have probably seen, right? If you average out the face of 5 girls in this case, you get kind of like one level of attractiveness. If you average out of like 20 and 50, and this is a good proxy for mutational load. Right, and you would expect that like very popular artists are basically have very low mutational load, and that's something that they would be like really willing to signal, and then call each other out. And the same, like the average of you pick any country, you will kind of like find conventional sense of beauty in the averaged out faces. Kind of like there's this quote from Jeffrey Miller in The Mating Mind, which is. Every sexual ornament in every sexually reproducing species could be viewed as a different style of waste. And I'm going to contrast here, the peacock's tail, and Ai Weiwei's, 8 million little like stones in the shape of flower seeds, and they were like all painted by hand and carved by hand. Could you imagine like the number of hours like spent on that? Just like massive waste of resources, and people, people get really hard about that stuff. they get really excited. It's like, but there's one more layer to like number 2, which is cool kids. So actually, signaling of genetic fitness is not necessarily the full story here. So here's kind of like an example. You're in a public transportation and you see kind of like a group of dancers, asking for your money, and you will see maybe one person is like really good at beatboxing, and another person is kind of like really good at breakdancing. One of them is going to be kind of like really good at doing that weird elbow thing, and and somebody's going to be bringing kind of a subwoofer, and sometimes like that's all it takes. But there's going to be one person who's going to be kind of like the central factor that kind of is creating the aesthetic for everybody else. That is the cool kid in the crowd. Now, everybody can be a cool kid. I think like we are genetically predisposed such that given the right cues, everybody becomes a cool kid. Because it's actually extremely evolutionarily adaptive. Basically, you're setting the aesthetic, and you can basically bias the aesthetic towards yourself. You can almost think of it as kind of like the tyranny of the cool kids. The art industry, you can think of it as kind of like a massive super cluster of cool kid gridlock that have control over the aesthetics. And basically, cool kids say, basically, what are the kind of like fitness competitions that are in, as opposed to the fitness competitions that are out. Now, there's a problem with this, obviously. Extrapolated, this cultural fetishization of traditional fitness signals, I would say ultimately leads to kind of like fascist, authoritarian, and totalitarian aesthetics. Kind of like power for power's sake, beauty for beauty's sake. I think like Joshua Bach, in his recent interview, he said like fascism as like the aesthetic of the best evolver, or something like that. And I think, but it's not necessarily the best evolver in terms of producing value. It's just being able to reproduce really well. And like who cares about that? If we were trying to generate value, we may not actually want to push in that direction. Plus, there's also huge advantages to neurological diversity, right? Like, whereas like a fascist aesthetic may say like, no, everybody has to be neurotypical, well-rounded within these parameters, and that's like the big one is the thing that we're optimizing for. Now, model number 3 is art as Schelling point creation, and a few hipster theoretical considerations. So, who is a hipster? So, I would say it's not merely somebody who likes the uncommonly liked, although that is kind of the perception, but that's kind of a cultural illusion. Actually, that happened more or less in the 2010s, when cool kids started to consider being hipster in, and people started to compete about being the best hipster. But hipsters have existed since forever, and they're like an important part of the ecosystem. So I would say, whereas a cool kid might be kind of like 1 standard deviation above the mean in terms of like openness to experience, hipsters tend to be kind of 2 or 3 standard deviations above the mean. They're actually like out there trying to experience everything and figure out like what feels good and what doesn't. And hipsters basically are an evolutionary force that enables us to basically, hipsters really like minimax strategies. Basically, they might neglect kind of like the entire well-roundedness of an aesthetic, and they will just try to optimize a very specific feature of it. I mean, it could be like, softness in clothing, or it could be like, Victorian style, or it could be just like something super specific and narrow, and they will be, the best at that. And hipsters and nerds are similar in a sense, except in different domains. I would say like hipsters are to nerds what aesthetics is to truth. So hipsters will pursue their own sense of aesthetic, independently of what other people think. And nerds will pursue their own sense of truth, independently of what other people think. Just as real nerds compulsively builds model of the world to optimize for accuracy, hipsters will do that for aesthetics. So like causal reality is more important than social reality for nerds, and likewise, causal beauty is more important than social beauty for hipsters. Now, cool kids have a love-hate relationship with hipsters because they can wrap them within their own aesthetic, but sometimes the hipsters actually do things that are way more extraordinary than something a cool kid could ever possibly do, because they're actually kind of like looking at the edge of our understanding there. And so sometimes like cool kids may actually not like hipsters for that reason. And definitely, really high-quality hipsters may disrupt the art industry, and cool kids are not okay with that. And finally, hipsters are actually the driving force behind like the creation of new Schelling points. I would say, I mean, just an example. I would say like Burning Man was probably created in that way. Like a completely new aesthetic wouldn't have been able to happen with the gridlock of cool kids. You know, kind of like this mainstream appeal, work religion type thing. And instead, yeah, you actually needed a bunch of hipsters and nerds in the desert to make it happen. And that's kind of like the generating seed. But yeah, the landscape of cultural meaning, you can think of art as that. It's kind of like creating these new pockets where completely new aesthetics can happen. That were just questions at the end. Okay. 4. Okay, so at the regional burn in Santa Cruz, I encountered this really interesting art piece. It's called Memento Morium. And basically it's kind of this casket. It's a sensory deprivation casket. And the whole idea of it was to get into it for 10 minutes, clocked, and make yourself believe that you died. And kind of like work through the emotional process of like, you know, like what did I do in my life? What didn't I do? What do I regret? Like, what type of things did I do just to please others? What type of things did I did because it was just, you know, an authentic drive on myself? I would say cool kids would find these very morbid. And hipsters would find it too real.
So is the woman.
Yeah. So it actually requires a new model of art. This is what I would call art as the attempt to get at the sacred. And sacred has to do with self-transcendence. Sacred has to do with leveling up your model of reality. Now, there's a billion different books about the relationship between art and sacredness. So rather than just like picking a particular type of sacredness, I'm just gonna show you like a list. So in Simulations of God, John C. Lilly kind of like mapped out all the ways in which people believe or think of highest values in the world. And here's some examples. And you can kind of interchangeably use God and highest value. You know, highest values are actually bigger than something like your ego. They drive your ego, whether you know it or not. And you have things such as, you know, God as the beginning, the I am God, God out there, God as him or her, God as the group, you know, God as war, God as science, God as mystery, God as money. And even more esoteric, you know, God as the computer, God simulating himself, God as consciousness without an object. You know, a lot of meditative kind of sacredness would be there. God as humor, right? Is all of reality just a prank that God is playing on itself? God as super space, so the ultimate collapse, the black hole, the end, the ultimate simulation, or God as a diet. So all of these are kind of very different conceptions of the sacred. And they kind of map as well with personal development theory, especially adult personal development theory, where there's like some conceptions of God. For example, God as out there, or God as him or her, kind of like God as Jesus, or God as like this entity that's gonna come and save you and punish you if you don't act properly. That would be kind of like in, you know, Ken Wilber's like integral theory might be like level 3 versus, you know, God as orgasm and sex, or God as science might be kind of like the rationalist level. You know, there's kind of like these different versions. One progresses in life into what becomes one's sense of the sacred. And in some sense, like art and aesthetics can be understood as a way of gathering people with the same fundamental values, the same ultimate values. They can recognize each other. It takes one to notice one when it comes to understanding a person's deepest values through their aesthetics. Okay, so that's kind of like models that exist. I'm gonna now talk about new models. So is there anything beyond the sacred? I would say yes. The 5th model is art as the exploration of the state space of consciousness. So the state space of consciousness is really large. And it's larger than you think, even when you take that fact into account. So right now, I mean, I doubt anybody of you think you know the entire state space of consciousness, right? But like, you may think like, oh, but maybe it's, you know, 10 times bigger than I think. It's like, no, it's much more bigger than that, like substantially bigger than that. But so a question presents itself, like how do we explore the state space of consciousness? I mean, think for example the sub-problem of how do you explore the state space of possible pictures? You know, there's a trivial way of doing that, which is taking a picture and replacing one pixel at a time. But the moment you start doing that, we are in the Library of Babel territory, which is like the overwhelming majority of pictures are nonsense. It really, there's the region of the state space of possible pictures that actually means something or could be useful or beautiful is extremely tiny relative to the entire permutation space. So there's kind of like this question of how do you explore the state space of consciousness intelligently? And here's one example. I mean, rather than changing one pixel at a time, something that you can do, and this is very pragmatic, you can do it today already, is train a style transfer neural network and identify in what layer of the neural network it's identifying kind of like an aesthetics layer, or what set of correlated variables is you could potentially associate with the aesthetics space. You train in a large enough set of pictures with a lot of like interesting aesthetics, you can vary that layer, and all of the pictures generated will be interesting, at least interesting to humans. So that's what I would call an intelligent exploration of the state space of consciousness. And I would say that art, in a sense, is doing that. At least a big part of art is doing that. Is people are like kind of like carving their way through the state space and saying, hey, there's this gem over here, come look at it. Yeah, here's another example. Right? For example, what is this? Right? This is this is me, but in balloon world, and this is me in blanket world. Now, what is the aesthetic of art as the expression of the state space of consciousness? This is what I call the rainbow god aesthetic, which is generating an intelligence that has access to the entire state space of consciousness. I mean, this can happen in any modality. You have like colors, for sure. You have the state space of textures. I mean, you have the state space of qualia mappings, which is sensory stimuli to qualia values. You can even have like the state space of rocks, for example. This picture actually, we don't know who took it. This was already there when we were there. But yeah, it's kind of like a state space of rocks, right? Like the rocks start all disordered, but then you can kind of arrange and figure out like, oh, and what are like the key axes of variance among rocks, right? And that allows you to, get the full picture of the entire beach without having to actually see every rock. Here's a couple of more examples. The state space of sense, right? Like, as far as I know, people who've actually tried to map out the state space of sense in a Euclidean way have concluded it's at least 200 dimensional. Is no less than 200 dimensions. I actually suspect the state space is hyperbolic, and we can talk about it, which is not only very high dimensional, it's also about different geometry. And yeah, you have kind of like the state space of tastes, right? Kind of like taste like sour, tart, tangy, piquant, nippy, like, and the rainbow god aesthetic would say, let's map this out. And that's kind of like the gift to the ultimate gift to intelligence and humanity would be to have like the map of the state space of consciousness. But we're not done yet, right? This is number 5.
Wow.
The rainbow god aesthetic would also care about the state space of emotions. And would actually be also fascinated not only about good emotions, but bad emotions, and mixed emotions, and weird emotions. And you can think, this is comes from some research that I did in my master's, which was basically mapping out the transition probability between different emotional states. And that's kind of in the same vein of the rainbow god aesthetic, because it's telling you how to navigate, in a sense, the state space of emotions. But there's some weird side effects of having the rainbow god aesthetic. Has anybody here tried salvia? And it's legal, so I think you can probably salvia. Anybody? Okay. For most people, it kind of sucks. It's kind of a dysphoric experience. I mean, it's really freaking out there, like really out. It's like a wormhole technology. But it does something to your experience that is really uncomfortable. And basically, it kind of has like these like weird inhibitory pulsing in your frontal lobe or something that basically disconnects parts of your brain and makes communication between parts of your experience impossible. And the way your experience kind of manages that is like by flattening your experience and sending like weird vortices and So yeah, in the rainbow god aesthetic, like yes, even the experiential vortex flatland hell realms of salvia are something that it wants. I'm not sure that's a good idea. We may not actually want to explore a lot of those state spaces. Definitely for core research, to maybe figure out what is wrong with people when they can't explain what's wrong, but not intrinsically, right? I would be very disheartened if the future is, 90% of people in salvia line 90% of the time. Like I mean, I should add, some people enjoy salvia, but it's rare, and they probably have weird brains.
Some people enjoy salvia. Okay, wow.
Very few people.
I enjoyed salvia.
I did.
Okay. Did you up the dose? I mean, there wasn't like a fully depersonalizing.
I think, yeah, I've had 3 fully depersonalizing experiences, and I enjoyed 2 of them. The other was mostly neutral valence.
Was the enjoyment because of new information?
Mostly.
Okay, that's because getting radically new information kind of in people who are very open to experience, right? Yeah, that's gonna lead to kind of like mu opioid activation, right? Like everybody in this room presumably really enjoys novelty. But once the novelty wears off and you're stuck in salvia land for 20 years.
I've never had salvia do anything for me. It was just like nothing.
It's
Or
fascinating.
very little.
Yeah.
Maybe you're already in
It was
salvia.
It was boring.
To defend your point that I had a dream that I was in salvia that had very similar effects, and it contained the information that it wasn't going to land, and it was absolutely horrific.
Wow.
So yeah, the dream about it was
Sucks. Thank you for sharing.
So salvia is actually, if you inhale it, it's really powerful and hellish, but if you do oral membrane absorption, it's actually really enjoyable.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's very dose dependent. There's a threshold in which it becomes vortex flatland hell realm. There's also a little bit of a, this is as an aside, but like the kappa opioid receptor, which is the one that salvia affects the most, in normal circumstances mediates social awkwardness. So you can imagine being like in high school, like suddenly appearing in front of all your peers naked, and it's like, okay, like this extreme sense of social awkwardness, which is multiplied 100 times. Okay, and yeah, no, these are like actual renditions of people's salvia experiences. They're not exaggerating.
Why are they all so spirally?
That's a good question for qualia science, and I think it has to do with like how it affects the structure of how your qualia, the geometry of your qualia flows. It generates limit cycles, and some of the limit cycles are circular and some of them are flat. But that's something to talk about later. Okay. Number 6, art as things that mess with the energy parameter of your mind. So you may not realize, but there's like an energy parameter to your experience. This is kind of correlated with arousal, how much energy you have, but it is not only emotional arousal. It's not only about like how much caffeine you took, how much speed or whatever. Because you could have like really high energy, very high relaxation states of consciousness. And those also would be like very high energy parameter. And this is a multi-ocular. It's actually a Unicode character, but it's kind of this, it's basically a symbol for like this particular type of angel that has 7 eyes. And you can think of like messing with the energy parameter as kind of messing with the amount of consciousness that you have. Imagine like just having more eyes, more sensory ability, and all of a sudden your experience multiplies. And I would say that there's a compelling case to be made that art is in a sense about that. So I'll kind of like talk briefly about the paradigms that inform our view here. And we can talk about it more kind of like after the presentation because they're very detailed and deep and technical. But I think I can convey a little bit kind of like the gist of it. So first of all, there's like predictive coding, the free energy principle. Well, those are two different researchers more or less converging on the same thing, which is this idea that your brain is constantly making predictions about the world. And whenever the predictions fail, that generates a prediction error that basically propagates. And in one paradigm, there's like free energy, but free energy here is metaphorical. What we would say is that actually, it's not just metaphorical, it's actually literal. There's literal physical energy that gets mediated by the level of surprise. All All right, did everybody expect that? DJ. All right, thank you. So hopefully that generated some prediction errors.
Well, at this time, now you've lowered our expectations, so you can do anything right now, and we will not be surprised.
Start taking a nap.
Bring in the cat.
Okay, so entropic disintegration is a paradigm by Robin Carhart Harris, doing like research on like LSD and fMRI studies of it. And he has like this entropic brain hypothesis, which is basically that psychedelics increase basically the entropy of your experience, which has to do with kind of like the predictability of it. But it also kind of like dovetails into actual physical energy. If you think about like a crystal structure in, for example, the metal, and you start like heating it up, eventually the metal melts, and then if you let it cool slowly, well, actually I'll get into that in a second. So connectome-specific harmonic waves, it's another paradigm, and I'll show you pictures for that. But basically that is the idea that pretty much any physical system where waves are traveling will have like resonant modes. Basically are like the ways in which the waves can fit together without canceling each other out, and usually they will be a discrete number of them. What Schelling and who developed this paradigm basically found was that if you put people on LSD and you compute their connectome-specific harmonics, you will see that there's a general increase in the amplitude of all of them, plus the high-frequency ones actually get even more amplified. So this is kind of like making the case that there's actual physical energy in your consciousness that is mediating kind of this energy parameter. Now, there's two ways of increasing the energy in your experience. Like number one is to reduce the number of energy sinks, and the other one is to increase the energy sources, and I'll get into that. Okay, I'll skip this. Okay, so this is connectome-specific harmonic waves. These are excitation inhibition wavefronts. The red part is excitation, the blue part is inhibition, and these are like actual physical electromagnetic gradients in your brain. And these are kind of like some of the solutions, some of the lower frequency ones. The higher frequency ones are extremely sprinkly, very hard to actually visualize. And the idea is that on any given point in time, you're actually experiencing a weighted sum of the brain harmonics of your brain. And that, we suspect, actually mediates a lot like how you're feeling, like your mood, both arousal and valence. Energy sources. How do you use an energy source? So how do you enhance an energy source? So one of them is surprise, and this ties into art, right? Like all of these like criticisms of art, for example, like an art critic might say like, oh, that art was like very kitsch, or it was like camp or cliche, and some people say like, no, that's just subjective. Like like everybody interprets art differently. Like no, there's something very real about that type of criticism, and that is that the novelty produced by the art is like fully captured by somebody who's already seen similar art, and it fails to raise the energy parameter, right? So in that sense, art can objectively fail at doing the trick, and you do require kind of like this constant novelty and expanded kind of like set of possibilities to actually do the trick. Sensory stimulation, and especially things such as like rhythmic stimulation, highly structured and rhythmic. So you know, strobes and rhythm in music kind of like get at that as well. Now, energy sinks, definitely there's like just the simple passage of time. We call it kind of like the decay factor. Semantic content. So basically, whenever you're in a highly energized state and you come to a representation that kind of like fits all the constraints that you're trying to satisfy, that will lower the energy of your experience. So basically, as well, art, you will ideally kind of like make it so that it's very hard for the person to interpret what they're seeing as something they already know a lot about. The more that you know about it, the more the energy is going to dissipate. And pre-existing attitudes, right? Like, what is the point of, you know, being in a kind of irritated or kind of a disappointed state and going to an art museum and going out of it and feeling exactly the same, right? Like, ideally, it's actually the art is not just pushing towards the same energy sinks that you've gotten accustomed to for a long time. All of these activities, I would claim. Pardon? Okay. I don't know what happened, but
It was a sneeze.
a sneeze. Okay. All of these are energy-raising activities with different mechanisms of action, different ways they're mediating the energy sources and sinks, but ultimately they all drive the energy parameter upwards. So art, as we said, via like novelty, philosophy, to a large extent by cutting out your pre-existing energy sinks. Like, right, philosophy is asking you to reconsider the nature of reality, right? It's saying like, oh yeah, your preconceptions are wrong, or like at least let's pretend they're wrong and see what happens, and that basically prevents the energy sinks from extracting your energy. Psychedelics, they increase very powerfully the energy source. And I'll show you an example of that. And meditation. Meditation is actually really tricky, but it's kind of a combination of a number of them, one of them being avoiding energy sinks. Right? Like when they're asking you to like refocus on the breath or refocus on, you know, pure consciousness or something like that. What they're really telling you is to not let that energy go into an energy sink. And if you do that successfully, yeah, the energy is going to accumulate, and that's going to do really interesting things. Yeah, psychedelics, you know, like the tracer effects. I mean, how this actually ends up happening in the brain is complicated, and it has to do with inhibiting an inhibiting process. But the end result is that you get kind of like these flashes of experience from the immediate past to kind of like stack together on top of your present experience. And people report that actually the overall amount of consciousness they have is more. And within this paradigm, we would say, yeah, that's actually more physical energy, more physical coherent energy that is bound within your experience. And maybe kind of like a quintessential, kind of like something that dramatically increases the energy parameter of your consciousness would be NN-DMT. And you get like these extraordinarily weird things, and there's like kind of like a threshold where the energy that you're experiencing, the energy that is being driven in your brain, is able to kind of like be canalized towards things that you already know. And in that way, maybe you will think introspectively in a small dose about your family or your work, and kind of like try to figure things out. But if you reach a certain dose threshold, the energy sinks are not going to cut it anymore, and you will get into these weird resonant states that don't necessarily have any particular meaning, but they're like very high energy configurations. Number 7. Okay, so we have like the energy parameter. There's another ingredient, which is two other ingredients, which is like annealing and the symmetry theory of valence. So annealing is, as I was saying, like you heat up a metal, and if you heat it above the recrystallization temperature, the metal lattice will melt, and then they will reorganize, and if you cool it with a certain schedule, the entire lattice will basically become more smooth and symmetrical. You will basically get rid of pinches and deformations and obstructions in the lattice, all the imperfections. Likewise, we actually suspect that this is the mechanism of action for why people report, for example, feeling much better after a psychedelic experience for up to a week. Likewise, like how meditation works, why art can actually have like really positive mood effects if you are getting art, so to speak. Of course, like that's going to depend on your particular energy sinks and sources and what art does it for you. But if you're actually engaging with art that does it for you and you cool slowly, you will get these very, very nice positive mood effects. And that kind of like builds up the case for like why you shouldn't go to a museum with your smartphone, for example. Or like you actually want to engage with it and not let that energy dissipate into the energy sinks that you're used to. You want that energy to accumulate. You don't want it to go to waste, right? So, and likewise, you know, if you're having a negative psychedelic experience, just cooling it right then and there, like taking an antipsychotic or like a benzodiazepine or something like that. I mean, maybe in extreme cases could be good, but in general, what that might do is kind of like putting a bunch of cold water on a molten metal, and then it's going to cool in these like very uncomfortable, highly discordant state. And then the person is going to stay traumatized for many months, and you don't want that. You want to actually let the annealing process cool down slowly so that they actually end up in a more smooth and pleasant state.
Is that a prediction from the theory or something not to be the case?
this is a prediction from the theory, like that. Yeah, I mean, it agrees with experience, but yeah, it is something that we can test in the lab, definitely. And the other component is the symmetry theory of valence. Like this is kind of like a super deep move. A super deep move we're making. It's kind of completely revolutionizes how we think about value, where we understand that actually in this theory, what makes an experience pleasant is how harmonic, how balanced, how smooth, and invariant upon transformations it is. It so happens that the things that are evolutionarily adaptive trigger highly symmetrical states in you. But actually what you enjoy are the highly symmetrical states, not the intentional content of your experience, so to speak. That completely revolutionizes how we think about value, if it's true. And one of the things we're trying to do at the Qualia Research Institute is objectively test this theory. But I'll give you kind of like one super strong piece of evidence for this, which is kind of like the correlation between psychedelic configurations and valence. Like people report that if they're staring kind of like at a picture, there's like this very weird effect that people have, for example, when they're having like visual experiences that and people have, it's kind of like we don't have the language to talk about this. But if you look at a piece of grass, you may see like weird things on a psychedelic. Maybe they could be uncomfortable or comfortable. And people have like this weird sense of like, how is it possible that my pleasure and pain is mediated by the structure of my visual field? But it's true. Like if you try a psychedelic, and you'll notice that the configuration of your visual field, independent of its content, will tell you things about like how you're feeling. And there's these kind of like attractor states, which are kind of when you're actually sinking into a particular symmetrical structure. This is a particular wallpaper symmetry group, and there's like a number of them, a number of those possible attractors, and all of them feel really good for very weird reasons, unless you take seriously the symmetry theory of valence. And I'll show you kind of like the extreme, oh yeah, these are the wallpaper symmetry groups. We now know that actually in a psychedelic, if you look at a pattern, any one of these symmetry groups can start to tessellate your visual field. And people have reported online that they would see symmetries, right? Like, but nobody had actually like sat down and like trained on what are like all of the possible mathematical symmetries and counted. It's like, okay, now I'm experiencing a star 63-2, or now I'm experiencing a 4-4-2, or 2-2-2. And there's like only 17 possible. I would also mention that super high energy states like DMT actually give you access to hyperbolic symmetries, which are like even higher energy than just these symmetrical configurations. And really the kicker, I mean like the thing that is almost kind of a religious conversion in a sense, is the experiences people report in 5-MeO DMT. So like people take DMT or salvia, right, and they go into these weird high energy states, and then they get convinced of all sorts of things, especially highly dualistic things. Like, I mean, if you're working towards kind of like a path of non-duality, DMT may actually not push you in that direction, right? Like you experience this profound sense of like, oh, there's this super strange alien intelligence, and you kind of interpret it as kind of like separate from you. There's a sense in which it's similar, but you know, this very complex hallucination is so compelling, it feels like very other state. And sure, you can experience high valence, high symmetry, but it never kind of congeals into a fully coherent state. But 5-MeO DMT, on the other hand, does. And it's so startling that people's conceptual frameworks for this, the only thing they can actually kind of like latch onto to explain the profound experiences that 5-MeO DMT produces is things such as like God, or like the most common things that people say on 5-MeO is, oh my God, and this is it. And if you examine the phenomenology of 5-MeO DMT, not through a spiritual lens, but through a valence, symmetry theory of valence, or specifically kind of like a Qualia formalist approach, you will conclude that it's actually an extremely hypersymmetrical state of extreme coherence. where basically everything that could potentially be an internal boundary, and you can think of like internal boundaries within your experience are encoding information. Anything that is an internal boundary within the 5-MeO state dissolves. And there's this sense of basically clean, pure, laser light consciousness bouncing off into the entirety of your experience, and everything becomes one. Now, people tend to have super strong, direct, realistic interpretations of reality. So they will interpret it as like, I literally merged with God, or I literally merged with everything. My interpretation here would say, you eliminated all internal boundaries. And because you experience the world and you think that you're actually experiencing the world directly, of course, if you eliminate all internal boundaries, it seems like you merge with the world. I would say it's more kind of like it drastically reconfigured the topology of your experience, such that there's like no boundaries anymore. And pretty much every person who tries this and has a full experience says it's the most meaningful, most profound, most blissful, most peaceful experience they've ever had. And this is kind of like the replications, right? It's not about the intentional content. It's not about like aliens. It's not about spaces. It's not about traveling to hyperdimensions. It's about having all of your experience converge in one point and shine the light together in this laser light focus, or becoming kind of like an infinite fractal mandala where everything reflects everything else, and it's all one within your experience. This connects to kind of some of the upper levels of kind of the sacredness, right? For a lot of people in kind of upper levels of personal development, their sense of sacredness might have to do with pure consciousness or emptiness, as they might call it in Buddhism. But it's not necessarily because you just like to engage with emptiness because you want to be a hipster, literally. Like it's actually because it feels insanely good, like feels better than anything else, any possible reward you could possibly have. And I think I would say this is kind of the crown jewel of evidence for the symmetry theory of valence, that 5-MeO DMT is reported as the peak experience of bliss and peaceful and goodness.
So one of the important things is the fMRI during 5-MeO DMT.
Yes, yeah, that's a huge priority. And I would say that if you have this conception, then you can actually have also an aesthetic of art based on this, where you stop caring just about like, oh, let's explore new states of consciousness for information's sake, or let's drive the energy parameter because that's like really weird and cool. It's like, let's actually get together and figure out how to anneal properly and actually have like significantly better lives because of that. And then all of a sudden art interfaces with the purpose of everything. Yes?
Oh, I wasn't asking a question. I was just saying.
Okay. Feel free to test.
Oh, just a thought that you experience these sort of like unifying visions, but some of the like high complexity experiences that I've had, they tend to, I don't know, as Josh was sort of overfit, suggests. With this very complex model, you like open up that box of space, suddenly like many possibilities exist. You end up with these various sort of like complex representations of what's possible. This seems like it does the opposite. This sort of like unifying, this like hyper-simplistic representation of what exists, and I guess I don't know. So I guess I like predictive models. Like how predictive does this feel? Like what is the purpose of experience? And I guess like is there a downstream thing for which it should be optimized?
Yes. So here's the no. It's a great point. So we all here, I bet, love novelty, and that might be kind of like a part of our personality configuration. But that may actually be because of opioid release triggered by novelty. And I would ask you to actually introspect on the nature of your experience whenever you're having a really good understanding of a better model. And it's probably going to feel like coherent light, kind of like this sense of very clean understanding. And the texture of that, I would claim, is this very simple, coherent, symmetrical state. So in a sense, like states of high understanding is kind of like the balance between the right level of symmetry to make it rewarding and the adequate level of complexity to actually represent the information. And it's true that a sufficient high dose of 5-MeO DMT, people completely stop being able to represent information. It's just consciousness. And Romy?
My sense is that it shouldn't be seen as a steady state. So, like, if there's some level of complexity that you normally habitually hang out in consciousness. The pendulum swing, like swinging farther in the direction of unification, it seems to dampen out a lot of fear responses, which allows like a subsequent further pendulum swing into complexity and diversity.
Interesting. Where your theories are actually mediated by your fear response.
Yeah, your ability to explore is somewhat bounded by your fear response.
Yeah, I should also point out, this is not a call for everybody to just run and do the 5 DMT. The reason is that the beginning of the experience can be profoundly unpleasant. There's like esoteric interpretations of that based on like your ego is dying and it's clinging to life. Our interpretation is actually like, oh, in the way towards these super symmetrical states, you're going to encounter super dissonant states, potentially. But I think there might be the proper way of actually creating the set and setting, where like you just directly go to super symmetrical states, such as, for example, pre-dosing with MDMA may actually do the trick. At least reports online, people saying like, I tried 5 million DMT, and I didn't experience a fear of death in the process of going to the pure coherent light consciousness. And that's something that we're really interested in. We are not masochists. We're not like, hey, you should feel bad about your ego. It's like, no. Like, let's understand this from a complexity systems, information theoretical sense, and like actually try to get better lives. Let's not torture ourselves needlessly. No need for punishment. And yeah, like these can basically lead to a new understanding of art and aesthetics that basically is really good art would be in this sense art that is actually pushing you towards these highly coherent states that kind of like melt the self-other boundary and allows us to identify with consciousness, which actually may be key to things such as avoiding nuclear holocaust, really important things. I do think like art is really important from these lens. And I will conclude with art as a system of affective communication. So it's kind of take all of the previous models and what do you do with them? I think there's kind of a super, Romeo likes to use this term, like super cooperator cluster of states of consciousness that we have barely glimpsed. So just to say something about that, there's like some gods, some states of consciousness, godlike qualities that say, I am the only God, and if you worship any other God, you'll put you to hell. Okay, so ignore those. We don't care about those. We care about the gods that say, oh yeah, I'll help you explore other gods, and like you figure it out, and like let's actually like figure out the entire map, like the entire map of the status of consciousness, and figure out the super cooperative cluster. Okay, like those are the good gods. Those are the gods we actually want, and we're really confident there's just a whole bunch of them. So art as a system of affective communication could be understood as kind of this process that we will go through in order to find the super cooperator cluster. Communication between different states of consciousness. So for example, how can a salvia man explain the DMT elf state? Currently that's impossible, right? But we may be able to find bridges between states of consciousness. And then in the future, even have like maps of the states of consciousness such that we can go from any region to any region without ever encountering any dissonant state in between. And that's what I call Harmonic Society. Basically, it's kind of this vision of kind of like, we already got rid of suffering. What do we do with all of the resources that we have? This massive cosmic endowment of negentropy. What do we do with it? And I think like, yeah, Harmonic Society might be a good candidate. It's kind of this super conscious organization that sort of identifies with consciousness and basically allows the kind of center points of attention to explore the stages of consciousness as they wish and add their information to the wiki consciousness so that they know what are like the possible travels that basically are devoid of suffering, but give you everything that matters in consciousness. This is kind of the map here is going to be, it's kind of like transcending notions of personal identity even. It's like stop identifying as a person or even as a time slice of experience or even with the entirety of consciousness. You could actually identify with all three. And if you do that, then you could potentially create a society where we all identify in this very strange sense, but I think it's cogent in some level, where you identify with your current moment of your experience, you identify with your trajectory, and you identify with the totality. And you're basically trying to improve the well-being of all of those three facets. And it would be kind of curing Rainbow God of the compulsion to suffer, which is currently kind of how people think of it. Especially, yeah, people who are into the Rainbow God aesthetic is like, oh yeah, but what about like all these like subtle, you know, sour, bitter states? It's like, no, you don't need them. I mean, like, you actually don't. You only need them currently because they drive an annealing process. But that's because we have like really messed up brains. And if we actually fixed them, we were not going to need at any point any unpleasant experience. Okay, so recap and conclusion. So I just added one picture for each of the paradigms. Art as family resemblance. Let's put urinals in art exhibits, call it art. Art as signaling. Let's get huge peacock tails. Art as Schelling point creation. Be hipsters as the evolutionary drive. Art as attempts at the sacred. Let's pretend we're dead and see what happens, or you know, all of these different notions. Art as exploring the stages of consciousness, Rainbow God aesthetic. Art as things that mess with the energy parameter, the multi-ocular. Art as puzzling valence effects, 5-MeO being the peak of that. And art as a system of affective communication, Harmonic Society. And thank you. All right. So let's say just 5 minutes for questions, and after that, I'll be showing like the pictures that you guys sent me. But feel free to disengage, have fun, have some drinks, some coffee, All right, feel at home. I'll start this way.
So you said that like benzos or antipsychotics might anneal someone in non-optimal state. So I'm confused why 5-MeO DMT, which has such a short half-life and naturally anneals very quickly, why that would be positive. But
absolutely true. So I suspect that a lot of people who try 5-MeO DMT end up worse off because they get this glimpse of extraordinarily ordered state of consciousness. They have no clue as to how to reproduce it, and they end up with these really strange metaphysics, as in like, well, if I convince, and this is very common, if I convince everybody that we're all God, then we will all be there all the time. I don't think it works that way. Seriously, you can find lots of YouTube videos. People are like evangelical, but it's gonna be that or something else. How it does work in practice for people who are way better off with 5-MeO DMT, as far as I've seen, are people who do it often and do it in not necessarily complete isolation, but definitely without like typical stimuli. So they might be with a friend, ideally kind of like away from normal society, and they do it enough so that their self-model updates to consciousness itself. And that could potentially be a very genuine long-term upgrade. But as it is, I suspect it's almost kind of a disservice if you just randomly give 5-MeO to a person or an animal. They will end up in this very weird, flabbergasted state. Not in the experience, but afterwards. Yep.
You mentioned about bound experiences when that the energy state within the boundaries of your experience is literally risen. I can think of two ways to do that. Either the physical boundaries are expanded, so there's more energy within, or the physical boundaries are retained, but the amount of energy within them increases. So which one of these two are you guys thinking?
Agnostic, currently.
Cool.
Yeah, to answer that, we would actually need to look into quantum Darwinism and the actual boundary problem of consciousness. Yeah. All right. Question, Jeremy.
Yeah. I think there's this version of the Rainbow God that experiences almost all of the space without suffering.
Yes.
In its experience of the space, and you can disconnect the sense that it is suffering somehow, given that that's just one other part of your conscious experience.
Yeah.
There's this sort of tacit ethics here, where it's like, oh, here are the like right states, here are the wrong states. We're gonna like get ourselves out of the suffering box into the right states.
Yes.
Yeah, I like my beer bitter. Thank you very much.
Agreed. Bitter is a great flavor.
But he was using bitter as an example of the things we want to avoid. It's like,
No. Okay, okay, this is gonna be super.
Very Rainbow God-y thing to say, but it's a thought.
No. But okay, so I know what I'm gonna say might be contentious. Hopefully, don't. I mean, take it as like what I've seen over many experiences of myself, which is that whenever I thought something like bitterness was like essential for some value in consciousness is because it was like playing some key role, given the structure I had, that it would allow me to experience highly consonant states. But I mean, similar to, for example, masochists, kind of like, hey, you like, being hit, but it's not just regular pain. It has to be like ritualized. It has to be within a specific context where it actually triggers mu opioid release, and it's very pleasant. And I think like, now that's kind of like in the typical human experiences. There's also the weirder thing of full spectrum states, and if you experience all possible flavors at once, including bitterness and including like all of the ones that on their own are unpleasant, the totality will actually be a super symmetrical state. And there's this very weird thing, and you see it all the time when people who take high doses of LSD or 5-MeO, they say, I started to experience all of the colors and all of the flavors and everything at once, and then I saw that huge rainbow from a certain side and all collapsed into pure consciousness. Yeah, so I think like in that sense, yeah, like the bitterness is part of the entire state space, and once you add it together with everything else, you get like super coherent state, but not on its own. Yeah.
Do you predict that if you have the super cooperative, pleasant states, that you'll still end up with consciousness clumping in one corner because there's like some preferable area of the state space? Well,
I mean, rationality ideally would be preserved, and the thing is like I really doubt that, our human brains or with even 5-MeO is the peak. I mean, like it's the peak of everything that exists currently, but no, I mean, let's aim for like Jupiter brains, for example. So like the exploration of the state space of consciousness, I predict is going to last millions of years, even if we do it optimally. Yep.
So I have two things. One is a statement, which is that, like, if I were having to choose to eat a like spoonful of like cocoa powder or sugar, like I genuinely prefer cocoa powder. Like it's much more complex. Sugar is like boring.
Yeah.
Second thing, which is my actual question, there was a paraconsistent identity was mentioned before the talk and said that it would relate to the talk, and yeah.
I was promised.
This is the paraconsistent. So actually, this is a symbol. This is kind of the culmination of three symbols together. I wrote an article, and it's called "Burning Man Theme Camps of the Year 2029," where this appears. So. Would you mind closing the door? So the central I here, that represents open individualism, which is we're all one consciousness. And then there's like kind of these threads, kind of like orbiting around it, centrifugally. Each of these threads is a different timeline. So this could be like a person. So kind of each of these threads and these secondary big eyes, you can think of them as like persons or narratives. And then these eyes, the smaller eyes, are moments of experience. And I would say, I mean, I've gone in my life through like many iterations of these. Early on, I would identify just with myself as a person. Then I identified with consciousness itself and thought we're all one consciousness. And I still think that to an extent, but I think it's even better to actually give each of these views its own truth. And like it really, there's something really fundamentally true about all of them. We may lack the appropriate understanding and consciousness to actually figure out exactly how everything fits together. But yeah, this is paraconsistent identity. It's like you exist as a person, you exist as a moment of experience, and you exist as God. Yeah.
Can you talk about your thoughts on the difference between like kind of manually inducing these hypersymmetrical states versus like these hypersymmetrical states being the drive that is the drive, is like transforming society or whatever, and that if you manually do them, does that actually give us an environment that allows that to be sustainable?
Yeah, so, yeah, that's a great question. So, okay, here's my answer. If we didn't have a way of inducing them, we would probably never know that that's what's driving us. Because, yeah, I think like, Josh, again, has like this quote, which is like, our reward function might have an insane amount of stupid in it for us to like, for it to be able to be very, very, very hard to debug. if you go to a monastery for like 20 years, you can debug it, and basically you end up in these high jhana, high attainment states. It takes a long time on that way. With 5-MeO, you could do it maybe within a month, potentially. But then the other thing I would say is that those states, I mean, I would call them kind of open individualist states. I think they're really good for society, because when you're in that state, there's two things happening. One, there's high valence, like this extreme sense of goodness. And there's high self-locating uncertainty. You don't know who you are. You don't know if you're a person, you're a moment of experience, you're a consciousness. But your agent generation process is not necessarily at the peak, but in some of the high energy, but not ultra high energy, is still going. So basically, your mind is going to be like generating these agents. That normally these agents basically are generated within the normal ecosystem of experience, which is like, oh, there's rewards, there's like this thing I could do, this other thing I could do. But and usually it's kind of like to benefit the sense of self. In those states, there's very high valence, so there's something at stake. And the agents you generate know is like, oh yes, there is something that is very worth it. And then on the other hand, they don't know who they are. So they will start actually try to figure out ways of everybody getting there. So I think like getting glimpses of it and creating buckets where like that is kind of like a culturally accepted experience will potentially generate a lot of agents that push in that direction faster, eliminate suffering faster. You've been for a long while.
So I was wondering, so if there's a palette of resonance that is not leading to greater happiness, well-being, valence, etc. That you said, like in relation to like the salvia trip. I haven't worked with salvia personally, so I'm just asking this. But depending on how the structure that you're flowing the experience through, different things are going to behave in different ways, correct? So does that just mean that we are not something that's constructed in a way to get high valence out of that, or like what's the relationship between like the organization of the structure of how our brains work and like if there was like a filter that says all these things get raised or lowered by these percentages, or it's like overlaid with another wavelength, it's something that could have like a harmonic set of patterns in a specific environment, but isn't in the specific environment of how our brains are structured.
Yeah.
So
No, I think a lot of the unique salvia qualia could potentially be high valence if we change how our brains are made or structured.
So how, with that question in mind, elaboration, if there are different constructions of brains that could lead to different ability to get value out of qualia, what types of priorities as creatures that want to increase valence for all the creatures that exist, what priorities or objectives do we have in understanding how different brain constructions, processing constructions relate to different ways of being able to interpret things? Like if there's a sort of structure that's like, well, there's a very broad variety of things that will increase high valence in this structure, but there's a very low amount of things that will increase valence in this structure.
Yeah.
How do we figure that out and then optimize for ensuring that things are able to get high valence without losing access to like, oh, there's something that's able to get high valence out of this situation, which gives us the opportunity to explore it using a mechanism that's not suffering in order to access that information.
I mean, that's a super large project.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, but it's a great point. I mean, long term, let's get a sane rainbow god. And then I mean, like, it's gonna be like, oh, how can we slightly tweak crickets so the crickets are like in a blissful but functional state, you know? And how to fix salvia so that, you know, salvia experiences are blissful and high valence, even though they're super weird in their own ways. And I think like understanding the actual shape of your brain, at least we can like connect with specific harmonics, is super important, because how your brain resonates will depend on the structure of your brain. So presumably, the optimal states for like cats versus, you know, fish, and like, it's very different landscapes. Yeah, it's almost similar to kind of like making an orchestra with different instruments. The music that sounds good is gonna be different. Okay. All right, I'll say like 3 more questions, and then we break. Whoever has a really burning question, like start jumping. Well, okay, Alton.
How can we as individuals operate as like a super cooperative cluster for you and QRI? in the next before the end of the event, and like if we had 10 minutes every day or something.
Right. I would say probably there's three things. I mean, like, definitely long term. 10 minutes a day, you could probably go through our material, read articles. We're currently in the process of prioritizing basically what are like the top articles that people should be reading, and we'll make that public. So probably that's super applicable for obvious reasons. We are looking for funding. So like anybody who wants to collaborate and help funding wise, we're super open. We're getting to the point where we actually have a lot of projects that do require funding to get them to happen. One key here is that because a lot of this is very exploratory and completely different than other paradigms, hopefully we get enough traction there, because chances are the projects we are currently doing will have to be heavily modified once we get more information. But yeah, the third thing for people here would be, tune into the valence landscape of others and try to figure out what is their bliss. What is the bliss of the people you meet in this party? Yeah.
Does it look like any particular outcome or activity or thing we can hand or like share?
No, but I'll think about it. So, yeah.
Could you introduce the interns?
Interns. Okay, so we have. Woo! Yeah, how about you guys tell your name, why you care about Qualia Research, and what you're doing this summer. Let's start with
Cool. I'm Kenneth. I am a rising senior at Harvard studying neuroscience. Consciousness is my area of interest, and it's my passion. It's the topic that I want to study for the rest of my life. Qualia seem to have exactly the same mix of interests that I do, namely neuroscience, physics, philosophy, spirituality, and psychedelics. This summer I'm doing some research on the relationship between time and consciousness. So if you're interested in time, or you just exist in time, talk to me about it, and we'll have a conversation. Yeah.
Timeless beings need not apply.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm Quentin. I just graduated from Washington University in St. Louis. I studied computer science and philosophy, neuroscience, and psychology, just an interdisciplinary major. And interested in consciousness as the universal Schelling point. I don't know, not much more needs to be said on that. What was the other component? What I'm working on this summer. So a variety of things, some outreach related, some like organizationally related, and then a couple of projects, one of which is on algorithmic music generation.
I'm Andrew Zuckerman. I'm a rising junior at Harvard studying computer science. And I, like many of you, have read stuff written by the three founders here at QRI. Not only do I think it's compelling, but I think it's extremely underappreciated in the greater landscape of the internet and the world and what people are talking about. Yet I think it has probably like utmost priority on things that we could be devoting energy and intellect towards. So I came here for 3 weeks, and my goal first was to help them translate some of their ideas. So I made a video for QRI to help explain it to like anyone, QRI for dummies, so to speak, and also just try to advance the mission so that more people can work on this project and progress can be made, because I think we're starting to have the right tool set to attack it. And you're in the home of someone who's putting up a good fight. So yeah.
All right, maybe one last question, and we break.
You seem to have this meta loss function, which you can judge other loss functions.
Meta loss.
Yeah. Like you and Josh were talking about, like there are issues with our loss functions, such that. And I wonder what I think this sort of waiting over correct loss function looks like.
Right. I'll write an article about it. To kind of like address a little bit. In the article, which again, for those who came here a little bit late, definitely take a copy of the article before leaving. yeah, basically I would say no art is above being examined through the lens of neural annealing. And I think, yeah, that means very, very strong, right? Like a lot of people think like, my art has something special that nobody else will figure out what it is. And why it attracts people.
Yeah, yeah. But you wrote down what specialness is.
Sorry?
Or if you know what specialness is in general, then.
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah. If it's like a really effective art in this sense, it's gonna have the mechanisms to raise the energy parameter and grab annealing.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you everybody. And I'm just gonna show pictures here. Feel free to break. There's the other room. And yeah, have snacks, have drinks.
Yeah.